Hello, I'm Leonard Garrison, and I'm professor of flute in the Lionel Hampton School of Music. And today I'm going to be talking to you about one of my favorite flute works, Density 21.5 by Edgar Varese. And I call this lecture Analytical Approaches because there's not just one analysis possible of this piece, but I'm going to talk about multiple approaches to this piece. So every time we analyze a work of music, we need to know something about the background of the piece, the occasion for which it was written, and something about the composer. So Edgar Varese, he was French, so you don't pronounce the D at the end of his first name. He lived from the end of the 19th century through the first half of the 20th century, and he was born in France and studied with a couple of the major composers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Albert Roussel and Charles-Marie Widor. So he came up in a traditional atmosphere, but he was by no means a traditionalist. He was considered an iconoclast, and his music broke new ground. He was very much influenced by Claude Debussy, himself an iconoclast, and by a work, a book by Ferruccio Busoni, The Sketch of a New Aesthetic in Music, that outlined a new path in music. And one aspect of Varese's non-traditionalism is he moved to New York in 1915, kind of abandoning his home country. And I think New York was fertile ground for him, much more so than Paris, because there were many composers interested in new ideas, bringing new ideas to music. So, and Density 21.5 is a extremely well-known piece. It was commissioned by the French-American flutist Georges Barrère, who was himself a product of the Paris Conservatory. He had a first prize from that institution, but he was brought over to play with the New York Symphony, which was the leading orchestra in New York, and he also taught at the Juilliard School. And he would frequently give recitals. And so he commissioned Varese to write in 1936 a piece for his recital in which he first played a brand new platinum flute. And I'll explain about the importance of that. Most professional flutes have been made out of silver since the mid 19th century. And then a lot of leading flutists in the 20th and 21st century have played gold flutes, most prominently Jean-Pierre Rampal and Sir James Galway. And it's kind of a status symbol to play a gold flute. But platinum is an even denser metal than gold, and it gives a particular type of sound. It is really good at giving the flutist a larger dynamic range, which is important for contemporary music, and especially for this piece. It uses a huge dynamic range. So this piece was premiered at the recital in 1936, but it was actually revised twice before finally being published in 1956, and that's the version that we all know, and has been analyzed many times and performed, by the way, many times. So I want to tell you, first of all, about the immense historical importance of this piece. We flutists have a repertoire very rich in Baroque music. Thousands of pieces were written for our instrument during that period, and by all of the major composers. this was not so true in the classical period and almost not true at all in the Romantic era. I mean, we don't have solo pieces by original solo pieces by Brahms or Schumann or Beethoven and so on. And on top of that, only a few composers in the Baroque wrote unaccompanied flute music, and then that medium almost disappeared until the 20th century. Now, of course, Johann Sebastian Bach and his son Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, and then Telemann did write a few unaccompanied solo flute pieces, but almost no one after that for a long time. So we could pause to ask, why was this medium not popular at all? And I think the answer is that when you're basing most music of the classical and, well, the Baroque classical and Romantic period was homophonic, with a melody line and accompaniment, and it's harmony-based music. It's based on the ideas of and the grammar of harmony. And it's hard to establish a sense of harmony when you have just a solo flute because there aren't any bass notes. It's all in the high register and it's a monophonic medium. However, Claude Debussy, most famously in 1913, wrote a solo flute piece, very short piece, only a couple of minutes long, called Syrinx or Syrinx. And the title refers to a Greek myth, the myth of Pan, who invented the panpipe. And the panpipe was wrapped reeds, a series of reeds, because the wood nymph Syrinx changed herself into reeds in the pond, and Pan cut those to make the panpipe. Anyway, this was a groundbreaking work because no one for a long time had written a solo flute piece. And it's become, if you know any flute piece, it should be the Debussy Syrinx. But it also set the stage because after this actually became a very popular idiom. And in alphabetical order, some of the major composers who have written solo flute pieces for unaccompanied flute have been Luciano Berio, Eugène Bozza, Elliott Carter, Valerie Coleman, Pierre-Octave Ferrou, Kazuo Fukushima, Paul Hindemith, Arthur Honegger, Catherine Hoover, André Jolivet, Siegfried Karl-Gaillert, Robert Michinsky, Shulamit Ran, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, Toru Takamitsu, and Edgar Varese. So this medium has quite a history. So more specifically, the importance of density following Syrinx is it was one of the earliest pieces to use extended techniques for flute, and specifically key clicks were used in this piece. They become very popular after this. And really for the first time in history, it uses the full range of the flute up to a high D, several octaves above middle C on the piano. And it uses a full range of dynamics from pianissimo to triple forte. And as is typical of Varese's music, the pitch content of the piece is not the primary element, but it is an element, but rhythm is equally important to pitch, and dynamics and register are also equally important as ideas of the piece. And another small thing is the language of the piece is very much different from everything that came before. Now, a typical gesture in Romantic music and classical music and Baroque music is a taper at the end of the note. It can be so beautiful to diminuendo at the end of the note. But Varese kind of upends that in density 21.5. And many of the phrases end with a crescendo into a rest. So it's very dramatic in that way. So I'd like to speak for a minute about analyzing Varese's music. He didn't compose with any kind of system. I mean, he came after Schoenberg, and Schoenberg tried to find a system of atonality to replace the previous tonal system. I mean, there was a grammar to tonal music from the 17th century through the beginning of the 20th century. And Varese didn't believe in systems. And on top of that, he hated analysis and the idea of analysis that you find how music works. Because here's a quote, from him, the composer knows as little as anyone else about where the substance of his work comes from. Sorry about the his, I know they're her regarding to female composers, but Varese is a person of his time. So we have a question, does density 21.5 defy analysis because it's not a systematically written piece? And the answer to that is many people have analyzed this piece. And very fortunately, there's a doctoral dissertation from the University of Iowa from 1990 by Mark Steven Dannenbring, summarizing 12 of the analyses that have been published of density. Density is probably the most popular piece in any medium from the 20th century as in terms of the number of analyses done of it. And so this is the list of people who have published analyses, Wilkinson, Sidone, and Corner, and so on, that are summarized by Dannenbring's dissertation. So many approaches are possible. One of these analyses by Carol Barron, an article, really considers density as an antidote or an answer to Syrinx by Debussy. So Syrinx portrays the flute, uses the flute as a nostalgic instrument, looks back to the ancient world. It's shrouded in mystery, and you know, all the edges are kind of blurred, impressionistic music. And Varese's music says the flute is a piece of metal. It's right in your face. There's nothing mysterious about it. It's right there, and you can manipulate it like metal. So, but more specifically, Barron points to parallels between these two pieces, and some of her ideas are not so convincing, but it's very obvious that the opening gesture of each piece brings them together. So Syrinx starts with a long note followed by two short notes, and the pitch content is you start with a note and you'll go down a half step and up a whole step. So here's the opening to Syrinx. Now, Varese has the same pitch content, of course, starting in a different register on a different note, but it goes down a half step, up a whole step. And he reverses, it's a retrograde of Debussy's rhythm, so it goes short, short, long. So here's the beginning of density. So obviously there's a connection there. So the form of the piece is not any, considering that Varese hated the idea of system and so on, it doesn't follow any traditional form like sonata form or rondo form or ABA form. But there are three well articulated sections of the piece. Measures 1 through 23 is mostly legato and mostly ascending music. And by the way, I hope you have the score as you're listening to my talk about Varese with you. And then the middle section is differentiated by these staccato key clicks that would have been very unusual for people to hear in 1936. And also within this section, there's a new tempo is introduced. So then measures 41 to the end are kind of a reprise of the opening material. You have exactly the same gesture and the same register and the same rhythm and everything beginning this last section. But it's, of course, not an exact reprise. And what I mean by abnegation of the previously established norms, we'll talk more about that later. But this last section kind of jumps out of the working procedures that are established in most of the piece. And so you have kind of all of a sudden new ideas at the very end, and it's a very dramatic ending because it's so unexpected. So let's talk about this opening motive, which is a retrograde of Debussy's Syrinx, that long, the short, long motive rhythmically. And pitch-wise, it goes down a half step, up a whole step. So we can look for the melodic motive and the rhythmic motive all over the place in this piece. So I'm showing you on the screen the first page, and you can see that at the end of measure 3, we have a repetition of the first motive. Then at the end of the phrase, at the end of measure 5, there's inversion and augmentation of the rhythmic motive. There's a long note followed by 2 shorter notes. And then you can see a rhythmic motive, measure 9, ta ta ta, exactly the same rhythm as the opening. Then at the end of measure 9, there's the same melodic motive, D flat, C, D. And it's also kind of an augmentation of the rhythm, 2 triplet eighths followed by a long note. And so you can proceed through the whole piece like this and see many times either the rhythmic motive or the melodic motive or both. And but the most interesting thing about this is the exact statement of the opening motive occurs exactly 3 times in the piece. And the 3 times that is stated are kind of an expansion of the motive itself. So let me explain. The original motive is F, E, F sharp in the low register of the flute. The second statement of the motive is in measure 15, and that motive starts on an E, which is the second note of the original motive. Now, if we turn the page, the final exact statement of the opening motive is in measure 41, and this time we're starting on the F sharp, which is the third note of the original motive. So kind of these three statements define the piece as an expansion of that little seed motive. So now, another idea not associated with that is that there's a prominence of certain intervals in the piece. In fact, minor thirds and tritones, and combining those ideas to make a full diminished seventh chord. So certain sections of the piece seem to be dominated by these diminished seventh chords. And let me speak about perhaps why Vare would want to do this. This is an atonal piece and not following Schoenberg's system or anybody else's system, but it's very difficult to write an atonal piece because it's hard to avoid a central pitch, or even within a phrase, the feeling of all of the pitches being drawn into a central focus. And so diminished seventh chords would be one way of getting away from tonality, because even a composer like Franz Liszt in the 19th century uses diminished seventh chords to kind of negate tonality, because all of the intervals within that chord are equal and you don't have a root of the chord, so it's ambiguous in the meaning of it. And many of the romantic composers, or especially the late romantic composers, use diminished seventh chords to modulate to any key that they would find convenient. So in the beginning, it's not immediately obvious, but it becomes obvious in the first few measures that he is emphasizing C sharp and E and G and B flat. So the E is just kind of a passing tone in the first measure, but there's a real emphasis in the second measure on C sharp and G, and continuing emphasis on those pitches in measure 4. And then you get more on the E in measure 5, and then you end up with the B flat in measure 7 and 8. And then this real emphasis on the G, B flat in 7 and 8, and then finally the D flat for a long time emphasized in 9 and 10. And then that so-called resolves, we're not using that in a tonal, but the D flat moves up to the D natural in measure 11. And now you have a new emphasis on another diminished seventh chord, this one D, F, A flat, and B. And you can see that tritone in measure 11 and 12, very much emphasized. And another a competing tritone in measure 13, the B flat, E, but continuing emphasis on F in measure 16, measure 15 and 16, and so on, and continuing with that diminished seventh chord, the B in 18, the G sharp there. So you can see this expanding all the way through this section. Then, and there are many more minor thirds in the bottom line of this section, measure 24 and so on, and tritones, lots of tritones into the second page. We don't really get another diminished seventh chord emphasis until the so-called reprise in measure 41, where we're emphasizing the G and the B flat, C sharp, and E for a few measures, and then moving on to the different diminished seventh chord in 46. There's a very high register where he's repeating over and over D, B, D, that minor third, and dramatic jump way down into the low register of the flute with the A flat coming in. So that's staying within that diminished seventh chord. And so then you see more tritones and so on. And starting in 54, um, uh, you have more emphasis on this same diminished seventh chord, C sharp, E, G, B flat. Now, the last phrase, which I think really starts at the end of 56 with a C, E, this is really the first time in the piece, instead of minor thirds, you get major thirds and whole steps. And the last phrase of the piece really shows you a lot of whole tone scale ideas. So it's breaking out of the norms established in the rest of the piece. So this is kind of showing you more about that. All right, so the first analysis I ever did of this piece when I was doing my master's degree in, let's see, that would have been between the years of 1980 and 82 at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, or now it's called Stony Brook University. I looked at the first part of this piece, and to me, it seemed like it was using what we call chromatic saturation. So this idea is behind Schoenberg's theory of 12-tone composition. In tonal music, we feel very satisfied when we get to the tonic pitch and the tonic chord. We feel the music is resolved then. And so what would be the equivalent in atonal music? A sense of completion and resolution. Well, Schoenberg theorized that it would be getting all 12 chromatic pitch classes. And so we call that chromatic saturation. And in Schoenberg's system, he did not allow a composer to repeat pitches because then that would provide too much emphasis on a pitch. So once you start going through what he called a series of pitch classes, you can't backtrack and you can't go back to one that you've stated previously. However, Vare's kind of in this piece, and of course, maybe he wasn't thinking systematically, but he is keeping a reminder of where you've been in a sense. So if you count the pitch classes as he introduces them, at the beginning again of the piece, F, E, F sharp, the first three pitch classes, and then the fourth is the C sharp, and the fifth is the G, and then he repeats all of those pitches, right? So there's a lot of repetition in measures 4, 5, and then you get some new pitch classes in measures 6 and 7, the A and the B flat, then some repetition. And then in measure 8, the C is a new pitch. And then back in measure 11, the D is a brand new pitch. And then, oops, I'm sorry, flip my mouse there. And then the last pitch to be introduced is the D sharp in measure 12. And so you have a certain amount of repetition. And this is why I've always felt that when you play the B in measure 18, that it sounds so fresh. And it's because that's the last of your 12 pitches to be introduced. So I'm really convinced by this idea of chromatic saturation. And when I wrote my student paper on this, I had no idea that other theorists have pointed this out. And if you read the dissertation that summarizes all of these analyses, some of them also talk about this idea of chromatic saturation. And again, it's not systematic, and it doesn't really play a part in the rest of the piece. There are sections where you can find maybe 8 or 9 of the pitch classes, but not really all 12 in a certain section. So again, he's not doing anything decided, he's not deciding to introduce all 12 pitch classes. It just sounds good to his ear. Now, another analytical approach, and this respects the equality of all the parameters of music making. Traditionally, we prioritize pitch because of all of harmony-based music that came in the 17th through 19th centuries. But this graph, which is from analysis by Grünbuhl, the German theorist, shows it graphs dynamic level, which is very, very specific in Vare's score, with the absolute pitch level, not just pitch classes, but where you are in the range of the flute. And so these two elements map onto each other pretty well, because the climax of the piece is that series of high Ds in about 2/3 of the way through the piece. And so definitely that's the loudest part of the piece too. And so that's interesting that the contour of the piece has kind of three climaxes in terms of both intensity and pitch. So another common idea in the piece, again, what analysis is finding out how a piece behaves and what are some of the common behaviors of the piece. And so a common gesture in this piece is this kind of almost taking flight, or almost taking off or escaping. And so these thrusts up into the high register. So you can see this happening in 16 to 17. These are in 12, 13. This is kind of out of order, but please forgive me. And then 16 to 17 and 31. And then later in the piece, go these ascending lines, and they're very wide ascending lines, very wide intervals, large intervals. And then the last one at the very end of the piece, and this is why the ending is so dramatic. It goes straight from the lowest note of the flute to almost the highest note of the flute, and makes a crescendo while doing so, and kind of leaves you up in the air. So where is this piece really striving for? So as a conclusion, I think multiple approaches to analysis of any work are valid. So don't get stuck in one approach or the other, but try to find what the nature of the music itself. Pitch class analysis may not yield much information for a certain piece, and that doesn't mean the piece itself is not valid, but maybe a rhythmic analysis would be more appropriate to that certain piece. So I thank you for listening today, and if you have any questions, please contact me, and good luck in your further studies in analysis. Thank you very much.